Ok ragazzi, proviamo a ragionare insieme su quello che il libro di testo ci propone relativamente agli anni 20 e 30. So, the 20s and the 30s, pages 238 and 239. Okay, if we have a quick look at the titles of the different paragraphs, we can have an idea of how many and important changes took place in those years. The first one is the vote for women, and then the rise of the Labour Party. And of course, the New World competitor in the USA and labor and social movements. New living conditions and a new family, which starts changing. The so-called Jazz Age, technological development, unfortunately, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and the New Deal. So let's have a quick look at all these different changes together. The vote for women. Paragraph 1 says that during the First World War, women took men's places in factories. You know this, remember, we read the poem Glory of Women, and gave a decisive contribution to the war effort. And by 1918, in fact, women made up about 30% of the total workforce of Britain, which is quite a lot. The battle for the right to vote was fought especially by the suffragettes or women's suffrage movement. Its most famous leaders were Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. The suffragettes had to resort to violence to secure equal political rights for women, and their meetings were often broken up by the police, and many of them were sent to prison. There's a film titled The Suffragettes, which can give you a very precise idea on how things went on those days for women in particular, who wanted such an important wanted to reach such an important aim, which was the right to vote, and were somehow obliged to use force because a kind request was certainly not enough to reach this aim. Now, the second important change you have to keep in mind, which is connected to the birth of the working class, the Industrial Revolution, Dickens, remember all that part, is the rise of the Labour Party. So, paragraph 2. Because of the war, industrial production had been maintained, of course, and there were great hopes for a better future. However, tuttavia, the post-war situation proved much more difficult than had been estimated. In 1918, for the first time, all men aged 21 and women over 30 were allowed to vote, and this is a great change indeed. This meant that the number of voters rose from 8 to 16 million people, and mostly workers. You can start imagining the consequences. These masses of workers had already increased the ranks of the trade unions, avevano già incrementato le fila del sindacato. From 2 million members in 1900 to 5 million by 1914 and 8 million by 1918. In 1924, the first Labour government was created. It should be noted that the Labour in Britain has never been totally identified with socialism or communism, though the Labour policy was and still is more in line with working class aspirations than those of the upper and middle classes. Always remember that British government was very careful, we said it many times, and always tried to avoid the cruel and violent social changes and uprising, for example, like the one which took place in France and turned into the terrible period called La Terreur. okay? So whether labor or conservative, with a different attitude up to the Brexit moment, let's say, the labor policy was closer to the working class aspirations, but never totally identified with what is called socialism or communism. And then the USA, we say, the other important big competitor. In the 1920s, the organization and diffusion of labor and social movements was directly influenced by Marxist theories, so prepare the link with Marx. The great increase in immigration and the fact that these new theories were foreign caused a sort of diffidence and hostility towards foreigners coming to the United States and their political ideas. The most dramatic example of this attitude was the Sacco and Vanzetti case in 1927. There's a great film on their story too. When two Italian immigrants were condemned to death and executed more for their anarchism than for real guilt. So it's a very sad moment. New living conditions and a new family. So other changes are taking place. Modern habits now set the tone of the age. For example, cigarette smoking instead of cigar smoking, cinema going, a less regular attendance at church, particularly in towns, freer attitudes in sexual matters. The younger generation of the British upper class gradually abandoned the quiet, gentlemanly style of their ancestors, see the Victorian gentleman, for example, and took on a loud and obsessive search for fun, earning the post-war decade the name of the Roaring Twenties, I ruggenti anni venti. This changing lifestyle also influenced the family, inevitably. What had been the stronghold of Victorian society now began to collapse. Stronghold, letteralmente la fortezza. Families became smaller as both parents worked. A rise in purchasing power corresponded to a reduction in the number of children. Divorces too became more numerous, rising from an average of 800 in 1910 to 8,000 in 1939. And the Roaring Twenties are inevitably connected with what we call also the Jazz Age. Traditionalist Americans, the so-called WASPs, which means White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, wanted to control social and individual behavior according to a model of white small-town virtues, which were work ethic, social conformity, duty, and respectability. And I think you can clearly see the link with the Victorian mentality and the criticism Oscar Wilde proposed of the hypocrisy of these values in his The Importance of Being Earnest. So prepare for your speech. However, against this old vision of life, new groups, immigrants, minorities, youth, women, black people and artists, started arguing for different styles of life. The 1920s, also called the Jazz Age, was the period of a definite struggle over issues such as individual freedom, social permissiveness, the pursuit of pleasure and progress, il perseguimento del. A typically American social and political phenomenon of the interwar period was prohibition, il proibizionismo. 1920-33. These are crucial years for European history too, so check what is going on in the 20s and 30s from your history books and with your history teacher. A law forbidding the manufacture and sale of liquor, which was passed in 1919. The notorious figure of the gangster arose in the 1920s in connection with the illicit trade of alcohol, which was called bootlegging. And this figure became famous in Hollywood movies of the 1930s and after, up to TV series. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, for example, The Sopranos, which keep on proposing the stereotype of the Italian gangster, unfortunately. I mean, unfortunately for us, not for the TV series, which was great. Technological development too. So new technology evolved very rapidly. The telephone and electricity now expanded on a large scale. The photograph record, the record player, the motion picture and the radio made possible a new kind of mass or popular culture. Remember these words. Now the mass culture is spreading in what is now becoming the mass society. The most significant advance in technology was the diffusion of the automobile, which, thanks to Henry Ford's use of the assembly line technique, could now be produced cheaply enough for most Americans to buy. But all this, unfortunately, didn't last long, and 1929 is there to remind us of what depression is. So the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. After the years of technological progress and economic development, in 1929 there was a sudden and dramatic crash in the American stock market, La Borsa, the so-called Wall Street crash. Stocks lost their value and factories, companies and banks were closed down. Millions of people lost their savings. Millions of people were without a job and found themselves in misery. In Britain, the economic decline of the 1920s and the Wall Street crash contributed to the so-called Great Depression. This was felt most severely from 1929 to 1933, when over 3 million people were unemployed. The areas most affected were the industrial north of England and southeast Wales. The New Deal is the American answer to this difficult moment of depression. And in 1932, the election of a new American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, opened a period of liberal reforms called the New Deal, which helped to reduce for the nation the worst effects of the Wall Street crash. Roosevelt's program, creation of jobs in public sectors, welfare, Stato sociale, unemployment insurance, agricultural reforms, and social security, gradually led the nation to recover from the depression. If we have time, we're going to say something more about the New Deal, which is connected to the passage from John Maynard Keynes, Can Lloyd George do it? And for those of you who are going to study economics in their future, it should be quite interesting and useful. Considering these ideas, you have to also consider, if you want to have a look at it, the new theories which spread in the 20th centuries, in the second half of the 20th century, by Michael Friedman, the so-called Chicago School of Economics, and their theory of neoliberalism. So absolute lack of control from the government and a completely free market. And it is also extremely interesting to listen to the lecture or read a book written by Naomi Klein entitled The Shock Doctrine, Il capitalismo dei disastri, if I remember well, is the translation in Italian, which is based on the assumption the journalist makes by collecting a series of important facts which took place in the 20th century in different countries, and which basically show how a natural catastrophe or a series of events can be exploited to undermine and weaken the economy of a country